Sarah Mitchell's legs felt like they might give way beneath her as she climbed the wooden steps of the witness box. The leather of her brown heel caught slightly on the edge of the third step, and she steadied herself against the polished mahogany railing, her knuckles white with tension. The courtroom of the Northern District seemed impossibly vast this morning, though she'd been here 3 times before. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sterile, clinical glow that made her skin feel paper-thin. She could feel every eye in the gallery boring into her back, her ex-husband's family on the left side, her own supporters sprinkled throughout, and behind them, journalists with their notebooks and calculating stares. Judge Harrison sat elevated at his bench like some modern-day oracle, his gray hair immaculately styled, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He was known throughout the courthouse as fair but formidable, a man who didn't suffer fools and followed precedent religiously. Sarah's lawyer, Michael, had assured her that Judge Harrison was reasonable, that if they presented their case clearly, justice would prevail. But looking at the judge's expression now, neutral, distant, already making notes before anyone had even spoken, Sarah felt a chill slide down her spine. This wasn't the expression of a man predisposed to believe her. The opposing counsel, Richard Blackwood, was already on his feet. He was a tall man with silver threading through his dark hair, expensive suit tailored to perfection, and a smile that didn't quite reach his cold blue eyes. He'd made a name for himself in family law by being ruthless, by finding angles others missed, by turning reasonable people into unreasonable witnesses. He'd taken her ex-husband's case 6 months ago, and since then, everything had spiraled. Sarah had watched helplessly as mountains of documents were filed, each one seemingly designed to chip away at her character and her fitness as a mother. "Your Honor," Blackwood began, his voice smooth as silk, "we are here today because a child's safety and are at stake. We will present evidence that demonstrates a concerning pattern of negligence, emotional unavailability, and poor judgment on the part of the respondent, Ms. Sarah Mitchell." He paused deliberately, letting his words settle into the courtroom like stones dropped into still water. "A pattern," he continued, "that has directly impacted the emotional and psychological development of her 7-year-old daughter, Emma." Sarah felt her chest tighten. Emma, her beautiful, intelligent, curious daughter who loved to draw pictures of butterflies and ask endless questions about how the world worked. The same Emma who had cried for 3 hours after her last supervised visit with her father, not understanding why her parents didn't live together anymore. The same Emma who sometimes woke up at night, calling for her mother with a fear that broke Sarah's heart. Blackwood approached the judge's bench and handed him a manila folder. "We have documentation here, Your Honor. Emails, photographs, incident reports from Emma's school, and testimony from concerned individuals who have witnessed Ms. Mitchell's inadequate parenting firsthand." Sarah's lawyer shot up from his chair. "Your Honor, I'd like to see those materials. We haven't been provided with." "They were filed in discovery 3 weeks ago," Blackwood interrupted smoothly. "Perhaps the respondent's counsel wasn't paying adequate attention." Heat flooded Sarah's face. She and Michael had been through every single document that had been sent multiple times, but she said nothing, just gripped her hands together until her fingernails bit into her palms. Arguing would only make her look defensive, and Blackwood was counting on exactly that. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the folder, his expression growing more somber with each page. Sarah's mouth went dry. She wanted to jump up, to grab those papers and explain what they actually meant to defend herself, but she knew better. Her moment would come. She had to wait, had to endure this carefully orchestrated character assassination, and then she could tell her side of the story. "Ms. Mitchell," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "you are aware that you are under oath, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Blackwood began his questioning with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't shout or accuse. He was far too intelligent for that. Instead, he asked questions in a conversational tone, questions designed to sound reasonable while leading her into traps she couldn't see until she'd already stepped in them. "Ms. Mitchell, is it true that on March 15th of this year, Emma was picked up from school 45 minutes late?" "Yes, but—" "Is it true or false, Ms. Mitchell? We have the school's sign-in logs." Sarah swallowed hard. "It's true, but there was a client emergency at my office. I called the school immediately and Emma sat in the school office for 45 minutes, wondering if her mother had forgotten about her. My daughter was in good hands. The school knew I was coming." But Emma didn't know that, did she? A 7-year-old's perception of time is quite different from an adult's. 45 minutes might as well be hours to a child. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She forced them back. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. He continued methodically through a dozen similar incidents. Times she'd been late to pick Emma up because of work. Times Emma had eaten fast food because Sarah was working late. Times Sarah had needed to hire a babysitter because she had to attend work events. Each incident, taken individually, seemed innocuous, but woven together by Blackwood's skilled questioning, they formed a damning narrative of a mother who prioritized her career over her child. "And would you say you're a workaholic, Ms. Mitchell?" he asked, his tone almost sympathetic. "I work hard to provide for my daughter," Sarah said carefully. "I'm a marketing director. The job requires dedication." "More dedication than being present with your daughter." "Your Honor," Michael objected, "that's argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Harrison said, but Sarah noticed he didn't sound particularly convinced. Then came the photographs. Blackwood produced them one by one, a series of images that had been taken 3 months ago at Emma's school fair. Sarah had been there, but she'd been on her phone for part of it. She'd been texting with a client about a deadline, a fact that Blackwood made sure to emphasize. "In this photo," Blackwood said, holding up a picture of Sarah holding her phone while Emma stood beside her, looking at the carousel, "we see Ms. Mitchell's daughter looking at the horses while her mother is completely distracted by work communications. Is that accurate?" "I was there with Emma. I took her to everything she wanted to see. One moment of—" "A simple yes or no, Ms. Mitchell." Sarah felt the walls closing in. She glanced at her mother in the gallery, whose eyes were glistening with worry. She looked at her lawyer, whose jaw was clenching in frustration as Blackwood systematically dismantled her credibility without ever raising his voice. By the time the morning session ended, Sarah felt utterly hollow. Judge Harrison's expression had shifted from neutral to concerned, and he kept glancing at her as though she were an exhibit in a museum he'd misjudged. The reporters in the gallery were already texting their editors. She could practically hear the headlines forming: "Mother's career prioritized over daughter's needs," or worse. As she stepped down from the witness box, Sarah's hands trembled. She'd been portrayed not as a loving mother, but as a selfish woman using her daughter as an afterthought to her career ambitions. And somehow, through Blackwood's masterful manipulation, it all sounded terrifyingly plausible. The afternoon session resumed at 2 o'clock sharp, and Sarah felt as though she were walking toward an execution rather than a hearing about her own custody case. The courtroom had filled with even more spectators during the lunch break. Word had apparently spread about the contentious nature of the proceedings. She noticed several reporters had returned with fresh coffee and determined expressions, their eyes tracking her movements as she took her seat at the counsel table beside Michael. Her ex-husband, David, sat directly across from her at the opposing counsel's table. He looked impeccably put together as always, navy suit, crisp white shirt, tie chosen with careful precision. He caught her eye and offered the smallest smirk, a gesture so subtle that only she would recognize it for what it was, confidence verging on arrogance. David had always been good at manipulating perceptions, at presenting himself as the reasonable one while she was the emotional, reactive one. That was actually one of the main reasons their marriage had failed. But here, in a courtroom with a judge who was already beginning to look skeptical of her, David's practiced composure was working perfectly in his favor. Judge Harrison returned to the bench, his black robe swishing slightly as he settled into his chair. He'd brought more files with him, files that hadn't been there during the morning session. Sarah's stomach lurched. Had Blackwood submitted more evidence during lunch, more ammunition to use against her? "We'll continue with the testimony of Ms. Mitchell," the judge announced. "But first, Mr. Blackwood, you indicated you had additional evidence to present. The court has reviewed the materials you submitted during recess. I find them compelling. Proceed." Michael leaned over and whispered urgently, "What additional materials?" "We weren't." But Blackwood was already standing, his expression radiating the kind of satisfaction that only comes from a winning hand. He held up a tablet and pressed play. The courtroom fell silent as a video appeared on the screen mounted on the wall. It was from Emma's school fall festival 3 weeks ago. Sarah recognized the setting immediately, the gymnasium with its colorful streamers and booths. And there was Emma, standing in front of a face-painting station, looking disappointed, waiting. And there was Sarah in the background, her phone pressed to her ear, clearly engaged in an intense conversation, her free hand gesturing emphatically. She was completely absorbed in the call, her expression tense, and focused entirely on whatever was being discussed on the other end of the line. The video ran for 3 minutes. 3 minutes of Emma waiting, sometimes looking back at her mother, sometimes turning away in apparent resignation. 3 minutes of Sarah packing back and forth, completely unaware of or indifferent to her daughter's disappointment. When it ended, the courtroom was deathly silent. Sarah's mouth opened to explain, but what could she say? The evidence was right there on the screen. The visual was damning, regardless of context. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrison said quietly, "can you explain this video?" "Yes, Your Honor. That was a work call from my supervisor. Our biggest client was threatening to pull a $500,000 contract, and I was on a deadline to resolve their concerns. I was only on that call for—" "So you were working," Blackwood interrupted smoothly, "at your daughter's school event, an event specifically designed for children to spend time with their parents and enjoy activities together." "I was handling an emergency," I explained to Emma afterward. "Did you?" Blackwood's eyebrow arched. "Did you really explain to a 7-year-old why her mother couldn't put down her phone to watch her get her face painted? Or did you simply tell her it was work, as if that would satisfy a child who just wanted her mother's attention?" Sarah felt hot tears streaming down her face now, and she couldn't stop them. "I was doing my best to balance." "Your best?" Blackwood's voice took on a sharper edge. "Your best resulted in your daughter standing alone, waiting for you while you conducted business. Is that truly your best, Ms. Mitchell?" Judge Harrison raised his hand. "That's enough, Mr. Blackwood. Ms. Mitchell, you may answer the question." But Sarah couldn't speak. The enormity of what was happening pressed down on her like a physical weight. She'd made a mistake. Just one call, just 15 minutes, and now it was being presented as evidence of her fundamental inadequacy as a mother. The video played again, and again Blackwood posed questions designed not to elicit information but to embed doubt. Each time, Sarah's explanation sounded weaker, more defensive. She found herself trapped in a cycle of justification that only made her appear more desperate and less credible. Then came the peace resistance. Blackwood produced several printed emails, which were entered into evidence and distributed to the judge. These were messages between Sarah and her office colleagues, dating back 6 months. In them, Sarah had discussed various projects, deadlines, and work challenges. But when Blackwood read them aloud, selectively choosing phrases and removing context, they sounded like the communications of someone utterly obsessed with her career. "I can't take that meeting because I'm picking up Emma, but I'll review the materials tonight," Blackwood read, his tone making it sound like Sarah was begrudging every moment away from work. "Emma has a school event on Friday, but I'm hopping to leave early so I can join the video conference." is costing me a fortune, but I need full-time coverage while I manage this account." Each email, presented in isolation, painted a picture of a woman resentful of motherhood, viewing it as an obstacle to her career rather than a joy to be cherished. Sarah's lawyer stood to object multiple times, arguing that the emails were being presented out of context, but the damage was already done. She could see it in Judge Harrison's eyes, the subtle shift from consideration to disappointment. He was beginning to see what Blackwood wanted him to see: a selfish woman, a negligent mother, a woman who should lose custody. The afternoon wore on. Blackwood called witnesses, Emma's teacher, who that Emma sometimes seemed distracted in class and had mentioned wanting more time with her mother. A neighbor who stated that she'd seen the babysitter picking Emma up from school many times. Even the school's administrative assistant, who mentioned that emergency contacts had been updated multiple times because Sarah's work number kept changing. None of the witnesses said anything truly damaging. Their testimony was mild, almost circumstantial. But in Blackwood's hands, each small fact became a building block in a structure designed to destroy Sarah's credibility. By the time the afternoon session adjourned, Sarah felt completely hollowed out. She'd been given an opportunity to rebut the accusations, but every explanation she offered seemed to fall flat, seemed to confirm rather than deny the narrative Blackwood had constructed. As she gathered her belongings, Judge Harrison caught her eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, Sarah saw pity. Not sympathy, not understanding, but pity. The kind reserved for people who failed their most important responsibility. It was infinitely worse than anger or dismissal. In the courthouse hallway, surrounded by reporters shouting questions she couldn't bring herself to answer, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The carefully constructed composure she'd maintained throughout the day began to crack. Her mother wrapped an arm around her, and Sarah leaned into that embrace, feeling utterly defeated. Michael was on his phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone Sarah assumed was an appeals specialist. But even he seemed deflated, as though he already knew that traditional legal arguments wouldn't be enough to overcome the damage Blackwood had inflicted. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah lay awake in the darkness. Emma was with her father this week, part of their current custody arrangement. The silence of the empty apartment was suffocating. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments. Tomorrow, Judge Harrison would render his decision about her future, about Emma's future, about whether Sarah would be allowed to continue being her daughter's mother on a full-time basis. She stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy with the terrible certainty that she was losing. Everything she'd fought for, everything she'd worked to provide for Emma, everything that mattered was slipping through her fingers like sand, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do to stop it. The morning of the final day dawned gray and cold. Sarah had barely slept, existing in that twilight state between wakefulness and exhaustion, where everything felt both hyperreal and dreamlike. She dressed mechanically, navy blazer, simple white blouse, minimal jewelry. She'd learned from yesterday that appearing too polished made her seem calculating, while appearing disheveled made her seem unstable. She settled for a middle ground that felt like surrender. Michael met her in the hallway outside the courtroom. His expression was grave, and he carried a leather portfolio that seemed heavier than any briefcase should be. "Listen," he said quietly, pulling her to the side, away from the gathering crowd of reporters and onlookers. "I'm going to present our closing argument, and then it's going to be over. I'm not going to lie to you. The judge's body language yesterday was difficult to read, but I sense skepticism. However, I have one final witness I want to present, someone important." Sarah's eyes widened. "Who? You didn't mention." "I couldn't. It was a strategic decision. We needed to preserve some element of surprise, and more importantly, we needed to avoid giving Blackwood time to prepare countermeasures. Trust me on this." Inside the courtroom, everything felt different from the previous 2 days. The gallery was packed to capacity. Sarah recognized faces from various news outlets: legal scholars who apparently found the case interesting enough to attend, and scattered members of both families. The energy felt electric, charged with the expectation that today would bring resolution. Judge Harrison entered and took his seat. He looked tired, as though he'd spent the previous evening wrestling with the weight of the decision before him. His eyes swept across the courtroom, cataloging everyone present before settling on the proceedings at hand. "We are here for closing arguments in Mitchell versus Mitchell custody matter," he announced formally. "The respondent's counsel will proceed first." Michael rose and approached the judge with quiet confidence. For 45 minutes, he methodically dismantled Blackwood's arguments. He presented context for the emails, explaining that Sarah's company had been on the verge of bankruptcy, and that securing that $500,000 account had saved not just her job, but the jobs of 43 other employees. He provided documentation showing that Emma's school attendance record was perfect, that her grades were excellent, that her teachers' comments were consistently positive. He presented expert testimony from a child psychologist who had evaluated both Sarah and Emma, and concluded that their relationship was healthy and secure. He showed financial records demonstrating that Sarah had invested every bonus and raise into Emma's education and welfare. He presented photographs spanning 7 years of Sarah and Emma together, birthday parties, school plays, quiet moments at home, a visual testament to a mother's devotion. It was compelling, methodical, and thorough. But as Sarah watched Judge Harrison's expression remain largely unmoved, she felt her hope slipping away like water through cupped hands. The damage from yesterday was too deep, the narrative too firmly established. Then Michael did something unexpected. "Your Honor, I have one final witness, a witness whose testimony I believe will prove critical to understanding the full picture of Ms. Mitchell's fitness as a parent." "Very well," Judge Harrison said, though he looked puzzled. There was no indication in the submitted materials that any final witness would be called. The respondent calls Dr. Lisa, neurologist, to the stand. A woman in her 50s, wearing a professional gray suit, stood and made her way to the witness box. She was sworn in, and Michael began his questioning with meticulous care. "Doctor, you are a board-certified neurologist with specialization in pediatric epilepsy, correct?" "That's correct." "And you have treated Emma Mitchell for the past 2 years?" "I have." The blood drained from David's face. Sarah could see him frantically whispering to Blackwood, who looked equally stunned. This was information that hadn't been in any discovery materials. "Doctor, can you explain why Emma Mitchell requires ongoing neurological care?" "Emma has temporal lobe epilepsy. It's a seizure disorder that typically manifests in childhood. She experiences focal seizures, which can sometimes progress to generalized seizures if not properly managed." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Harrison's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Blackwood was on his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This is irrelevant information that—" "Sit down, Mr. Blackwood," Judge Harrison said sharply. "Let's hear this." Michael continued, "Doctor, how severe is Emma's condition?" "Without proper management and monitoring, Emma could experience seizures that result in serious injury. She could fall, hit her head, suffer aspiration during a seizure. There's also a small but real risk of sudden unexpected nocturnal death in epilepsy, SUDEP. It's rare, but it happens." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what was happening. This was the truth that David had hidden, the secret that had kept her working late into the nights, researching, learning, preparing. "And how has Ms. Mitchell managed Emma's care?" Michael asked. "Exemplarily. Ms. Mitchell is more knowledgeable about her daughter's condition than most parents I encounter. She maintains meticulous records of seizure activity, medication compliance, triggers. She's attended every appointment, every consultation. She's researched treatment options, asked intelligent questions, advocated fiercely for her daughters." Blackwood was now frantically consulting with David, whose face had gone pale. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his earlier skepticism transforming into something resembling realization. "Doctor," Michael concluded, "in your professional opinion, is it important for Emma to have access to specialized support in managing her epilepsy?" "Absolutely critical. A child with Emma's condition needs a parent who is informed, vigilant, and dedicated. Ms. Mitchell exemplifies all of these qualities." As Doctor stepped down from the witness stand, Sarah felt something shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Judge Harrison's expression had transformed from skeptical to thoughtful, but he hadn't yet reached the point of actual belief. Michael returned to his seat and whispered, "Now we wait. Blackwood will respond, and then the judge will deliberate." But then Richard Blackwood made a crucial error. In his rebuttal, he attempted to discredit Doctor, suggesting that she was biased, that epilepsy was perhaps not as serious as claimed, that Sarah was using the condition as a manipulation tactic. His tone became aggressive, dismissive, and for the first time, his carefully maintained composure cracked to reveal the ruthlessness beneath. Judge Harrison's jaw clenched as he listened. The reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Then, as Blackwood sat down, seemingly satisfied with his counterattack, something extraordinary happened. Sarah's mother, sitting in the front row of the gallery, quietly tapped the shoulder of the victim advocate, the court-appointed social worker who had brought Bailey, Emma's comfort dog, for emotional support during the proceedings. Bailey, a golden retriever with a service vest, was lying peacefully beside the advocate's chair. But he was more than just a comfort dog. He was a specially trained alert dog, one of only a handful in the state trained specifically to recognize the neurological patterns that preceded Emma's seizures. Sarah's eyes met Bailey's, and in that moment of recognition, something crystallized in her mind. She'd been so focused on explaining, on defending, on trying to make people understand through words and documents and expert testimony. But there was one piece of evidence she hadn't been allowed to present, one that transcended the courtroom's rules and procedures. Her hands trembling, Sarah slowly turned her body toward the dog. She made a subtle gesture, a specific hand signal that had been part of Bailey's training protocol. It was a signal that only someone deeply involved in Emma's care would know, a signal that only a mother who had spent countless nights studying her daughter's condition would have learned. Bailey's head lifted immediately. His ears perked up. Then, with purpose and deliberation, the golden retriever stood and walked directly towards Sarah, crossing the courtroom with measured steps. Photographers' cameras began clicking frantically. Blackwood's eyes bulged in shock. David's face contorted in confusion and dawning horror. Bailey placed his head gently in Sarah's lap, nuzzling against her trembling hands, and let out a soft, almost reassuring whine. In that single moment, everything changed. Judge Harrison's face transformed. His eyes widened as understanding flooded through him. He sat back in his chair, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. The courtroom fell into absolute, stunned silence. Sarah looked directly at the judge, her hand stroking Bailey's soft fur, her eyes communicating what words could never adequately convey. "I have been telling you the truth all along. This child is my life. Everything I have done, every late night, every difficult choice, every moment of this entire ordeal has been about protecting my daughter." Judge Harrison stared at her for a long moment, then looked at David, whose face had transformed from shock to something resembling panic. The judge's expression shifted from wonder to something darker, a dawning realization of the magnitude of the deception he'd almost enabled. His hand moved toward his gavel. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a force that shook the entire courtroom. The sound was thunderous, authoritative, and final, a sonic exclamation point that silenced even the furious clicking of camera shutters. His eyes, which had been distant and analytical throughout the previous 2 days, now blazed with a fury so intense that seasoned attorneys in the gallery visibly flinched. "Bailiff, freeze this proceding," he commanded, his voice booming through the speakers mounted in the courtroom's corners. His judicial composure, maintained with meticulous precision throughout the hearing, had shattered like glass. Every head in the courtroom snapped toward him. The reporters leaned forward, their journalistic instincts firing as they recognized this as the moment, the turning point where something fundamental had shifted in the case's trajectory. Judge Harrison removed his glasses with deliberate slowness and set them carefully on the bench before him. He rubbed his eyes with the thumb and forefinger of his right hand, a gesture that conveyed exhaustion, disbelief, and profound disappointment all at once. When he opened his eyes again, they fixed directly on Sarah. In that gaze, she saw something she hadn't expected, recognition of the truth, and with it, something approaching remorse. "Counselors," the judge said quietly, his voice now controlled but laced with underlying rage, "approach the bench. Now." Michael stood immediately, his expression carefully neutral, though Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. Across the aisle, Richard Blackwood rose more slowly, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. He glanced at David, whose face had gone the color of old newspaper. David looked as though he might be ill. As the attorneys approached the bench, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Bailey remained at her side, his head still resting against her leg, his presence grounding her in the moment. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom upon her, some sympathetic, some confused, some calculating the angles of this new development. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving between Michael and Blackwood with the intensity of a predator assessing prey. When he spoke, his voice was kept deliberately low, audible only to those standing at the bench, but his body language conveyed absolute authority. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his tone cutting like a knife, "I want you to explain to me what I just witnessed. Because what I saw was a service animal responding to a specific command from Ms. Mitchell, a command that indicates intimate knowledge and involvement in the care of a child with a serious medical condition. A condition that, if my understanding is correct, was never disclosed to this court." Blackwood's jaw worked soundlessly. Sarah watched from her seat as he leaned forward and began whispering urgently, but Judge Harrison cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm not interested in explanations at this moment, Mr. Blackwood. What I'm interested in is understanding how critical medical information regarding the plaintiffs, the respondent's daughter, was omitted from discovery materials. How information vital to assessing parental fitness was deliberately." He turned to Michael. "Mr. I assume this is the first time the plaintiff has been presented with evidence of this condition." "It is, Your Honor," Michael confirmed. "Moreover, we only became aware of Emma's epilepsy through doctor's testimony minutes ago. This information was actively concealed." The judge's face flushed crimson. He looked as though he might actually strike the bench with his fist, but he restrained himself. Instead, he took a deep breath and gestured for both attorneys to return to their seats. "You're going to take a 30-minute recess," Judge Harrison announced to the courtroom, his voice loud and clear. "During this time, I want the following. Mr. I want all medical records relating to Emma Mitchell's condition, her treatment, and her care. Mr. Blackwood, I want you to provide a complete accounting of what your client knows regarding his daughter's medical condition and when he became aware of it. I also want written explanation for why this information was not disclosed in discovery." He turned to Bailey, who had settled into a calm sit beside Sarah's chair. "And someone will explain to me exactly what this dog is, what training it has received, and what relationship it has to Emma Mitchell's care." The courtroom erupted the moment the judge stood to leave the bench. Reporters were shouting questions. David's family looked shocked and confused. Photographers' flashes created a strobe-like effect. The bailiff had to raise his voice to restore some semblance of order. Michael immediately turned to Sarah and gripped her shoulder. "That was brilliant," he whispered. "Absolutely brilliant. Do you understand what just happened?" Sarah was trembling too intensely to respond. She'd made an impulsive decision, an act that violated courtroom protocol and procedural rules. She could have been held in contempt, but somehow, miraculously, it had worked. The judge had seen what she needed him to see, not as a legal argument but as pure, undeniable truth. During the recess, Sarah sat in a small consultation room with Michael while he reviewed the medical files that were hurriedly retrieved from Doctor, who was still waiting in the hallway. The documents told a story that made Michael's eyes widen with each page. "Do you understand the implications of this?" he asked, looking up from the files. "These records show that Emma has been having seizures, sometimes multiple times per week, for the past 2 years. Your ex-husband had to have known. He was present at her 6th birthday party when she had a seizure. He's listed as an emergency contact with the neurologist's office." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. He never wanted to acknowledge it. When Emma was first diagnosed, that it was serious. He said I was overreacting, turning her into a sick child in my mind. He refused to attend appointments. When I insisted on strict medication compliance and seizure monitoring, he accused me of medicating her unnecessarily, of using her condition as an excuse for why I couldn't accommodate his schedule. Michael listened intently, his legal mind cataloging every detail for potential use. "And the dog, Bailey. I found Bailey through a specialized trainer 3 months ago. David doesn't know about him. I've been keeping that information separate because I knew David would try to claim I was exploiting Emma's condition for sympathy. But Bailey is critical. He can alert to Emma's seizures sometimes up to 30 minutes before they occur. He's given Emma a sense of security that she didn't have before." A knock at the door interrupted them. Judge Harrison's clerk entered and informed them that the judge wanted to see both Michael and Blackwood in his chambers immediately, without the clients present. Michael stood, squeezing Sarah's shoulder once more. "Stay here. Whatever happens next, you've already changed the outcome of this case. The judge has seen the truth now. There's no unseeing it." The 30 minutes stretched into 45. Sarah sat alone in the consultation room, Bailey's head resting on her lap, and allowed herself to hope. It was a fragile hope, tentative and scared, but it was there nonetheless. When Michael returned, his expression was impossible to read. "The judge is very angry," he said quietly. "He's ordered a full investigation into why this medical information was concealed. He's also considering sanctions against Blackwood's firm and potentially against your ex-husband personally. But here's what's important. He's also indicated that his entire perspective on this case has shifted." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, barely daring to breathe. "It means that when we return to the courtroom, things are going to be very different. The judge sees you differently now. He understands what he almost did, almost took Emma away from the one parent who was actually protecting her, almost punished a mother for the very thing that makes her an exceptional parent." As they made their way back toward the courtroom, reporters surrounded them, shouting questions. But Michael guided Sarah through the crowd with quiet determination, his hand protectively on her back. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, and Sarah could feel her heart beginning to race again. Bailey walked beside her, calm and steady, his presence a reminder that truth had a way of revealing itself, even in the most formidable places. Judge Harrison was already seated at the bench when they entered. His expression was grave, but there was something new in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the magnitude of what had nearly happened on his watch. The next words he spoke would change everything. Judge Harrison's chambers had been cleared of all personnel except for the court stenographer. Sarah sat rigidly in the wooden chair across from the judge's mahogany desk, Michael beside her, while David and Blackwood occupied chairs to her left. The atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with the weight of truths about to be exposed. "I have reviewed the medical records provided by Dr. Judge Harrison began, his voice measured but cold. He held up a thick folder, the same one that would eventually be entered into the court record as evidence of deliberate concealment. These documents indicate that Emma Mitchell was diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy approximately 2 years and 3 months ago. They further indicate that the plaintiff, he looked directly at David, was present at the initial consultation where the diagnosis was confirmed. David's face had taken on a grayish pallor. He looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Harrison continued, "I'm going to ask you directly, and I advise you to consider very carefully before you answer. Were you aware of your daughter's epilepsy diagnosis?" Blackwood leaned over and whispered something urgently to David, who looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. For a long moment, David said nothing. Then, almost inaudibly, he nodded. "I need a verbal response for the record," Judge Harrison said. "Yes," David managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was aware." The judge's jaw clenched. He turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, I would like you to explain, in your own words, what your daughter's condition is and how it has affected your parenting decisions over the past 2 years." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She'd rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in her mind, but now that the moment had arrived, her throat felt impossibly tight. Bailey was waiting outside in the courtroom, but she could almost feel his calming presence, could almost hear the gentle whine he made when she was distressed. "Emma was 7 years old when she was diagnosed," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly before finding its footing. "She had a seizure at school, a focal seizure that lasted about 45 seconds. Her teacher called an ambulance. Emma was taken to County Hospital where they ran tests. That's where they found the epilepsy." She paused, remembering that day with perfect clarity. The terror of receiving a call from the school. The helplessness of sitting in a hospital waiting room. The neurologist's calm but serious explanation of what temporal lobe epilepsy meant for Emma's future. The neurologist explained that Emma could have focal seizures, which are usually brief and localized to one part of the brain, but they could potentially progress to generalized seizures. Without proper medication management, without proper supervision and monitoring, Emma could suffer serious injury during a seizure. She could fall. She could hit her head. She could. Sarah's voice cracked. She swallowed hard before continuing. She could experience sudden, unexpected nocturnal death in epilepsy. SUDEP. It's rare, but it happens. There are children who go to sleep having properly managed their condition, and they simply don't wake up. The exact mechanism isn't fully understood, but the risk is real. Judge Harrison was taking notes, his expression grave. "So I changed everything," Sarah continued. "I began researching epilepsy obsessively. I attended every neurology appointment. I learned about medication interactions, about potential triggers, about how seizures could be managed. I talked to other parents. I joined support groups. I read medical journals. I became an expert in my daughter's condition because her life depended on it." She turned slightly to look at David, though she addressed the judge. "When we were still married, my ex-husband refused to take any of this seriously. He said that epilepsy wasn't that dangerous, that I was turning Emma into a sick child. He refused to attend support group meetings. He wouldn't learn Emma's medication schedule. He actually suggested that we could just see if Emma could manage without medication, that maybe doctors were being overly cautious." Blackwood started to object, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a look. "After the divorce," Sarah continued, "I realized that Emma needed consistent, vigilant care. I needed to be available in case of a seizure. I needed to monitor her medications meticulously. I needed to maintain detailed records of her seizure activity so I could work with her neurologist to optimize her treatment plan. That's why I sometimes seemed distracted by work. I was often communicating with my office about deadlines I could make flexible, about meetings I could reschedule, about how to structure my career so that Emma's medical needs always came first." She described the night shifts researching treatment options, the early mornings preparing Emma's medications, the careful coordination with the school about how to respond if Emma had a seizure, the investment in Bailey's specialized training, money that had come from her bonuses, her savings, every extra penny she could scrape together to give her daughter the best possible support. "That video from the school fair," Sarah said, her eyes meeting Judge Harrison's. "The one where I was on my phone. I was calling the school's nurse. I was checking on Emma during a time when she was more likely to have a seizure based on her medication schedule and the time of day. Not because I didn't want to be present with my daughter, but because I was being hypervigilant about her safety." Judge Harrison turned to David. "Mr. Mitchell, why did you not disclose your daughter's medical condition in the discovery materials? Why did you not mention it in your custody petition?" David's attorney leaned over to whisper to him again, but the judge cut him off. "Your client will answer the question directly." David looked at Sarah, and for just a moment she saw something like shame flicker across his face before he suppressed it. "I didn't think it was relevant," he said weakly. "Emma's condition is managed. She hasn't had a seizure in months." "Because of her mother's diligent care," Judge Harrison observed coldly. "Because Ms. Mitchell has managed her medication precisely, monitored her closely, and invested tremendous energy into ensuring her safety. You attempted to use your daughter's well-being as a weapon in a custody battle, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge the very condition that makes her need specialized care." The judge stood and walked to the window, looking out over the courthouse plaza where reporters were undoubtedly gathering, speculating about what was happening in these chambers. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, turning back to face her, "the behaviors that the opposing counsel presented as evidence of parental neglect were actually evidence of extraordinary devotion. The late pickups from school. You were handling work emergencies so you could maintain the flexible schedule necessary to accommodate Emma's medical appointments and seizure management. The work emails. You were communicating with your employer about restructuring your responsibilities around your daughter's needs. The phone calls during school events. You were conducting health and safety checks." He turned to face David directly. "And you, Mr. Mitchell, used your daughter's condition against her own mother. You information from the court. You presented carefully manipulated evidence designed to paint a devoted mother as neglectful. In doing so, you nearly succeeded in removing a child with a serious medical condition from the care of the parent best equipped to manage that condition." The judge returned to his desk and made several notes. When he looked up, his expression was harder than anything Sarah had seen from him. "This court is going to take a brief recess. When we reconvene in this courtroom, I will be issuing my ruling, and I will have several things to say about the conduct of Mr. Mitchell and his counsel in this proceeding." As they filed out of the chambers, Sarah felt Michael's hand squeeze her shoulder. In the hallway, she immediately bent down and wrapped her arms around Bailey, who pressed his head against her chest, his presence a warm reminder that she'd done the right thing, even when the world had made her doubt it. David walked past without looking at her, his shoulders slumped, his swagger completely gone. As he disappeared around the corner with Blackwood, Sarah allowed herself to believe, for the first time since this ordeal began, that she might actually win. Not just the custody case, but something far more important, the validation that she had loved her daughter the right way all along. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison re-entered from his chambers. The gallery had swelled to overflowing, with standing room only along the back walls. News vans were now stationed outside the courthouse. Word had spread through legal circles that something significant was happening in this custody case. Sarah sat rigidly at the counsel table, Michael beside her, while Bailey remained calm and steady at her feet, seemingly unbothered by the tension crackling through the room. Judge Harrison wasted no time. "I am going to order immediate production of all medical records related to Emma Mitchell's epilepsy," he announced. "I want emergency room records, neurology appointment summaries, medication documentation, and seizure logs, all of it, presented to this court within the hour." David's attorney began to protest, but the judge raised his hand. "I'm not finished. I'm also ordering a continuance of 1 day so that I can review these materials thoroughly. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, at which time I will issue my ruling." The gavel came down again, and Judge Harrison stood to leave, but then he paused. He looked directly at Sarah with an expression that conveyed both apology and determination. "Ms. Mitchell, you will remain available tomorrow morning. There are matters this court needs to address with you." As the judge disappeared into his chambers, the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, already composing their stories. David looked absolutely devastated, his face ashen. He turned to Blackwood and began whispering urgently, but the attorney's body language suggested he had no solutions left to offer. That evening, Michael's office became command central. Files were spread across every available surface as paralegals and research assistants worked frantically to organize every piece of documentation related to Sarah's care of Emma. What emerged was nothing short of remarkable. Sarah's personal records, maintained in meticulous detail, told a story of extraordinary maternal devotion. She had created elaborate spreadsheets documenting Emma's seizure activity, noting the date, time, duration, symptoms preceding the seizure, and recovery time. Cross-referenced with these logs were Emma's medication schedules, dosage adjustments recommended by her neurologist, and notes about potential triggers. There were printed emails between Sarah and Doctor, stretching back 2 years. The exchanges revealed Sarah asking informed, intelligent questions about her daughter's condition. She asked about medication interactions, about the potential for drug resistance, about alternative treatment approaches. She wasn't just passively accepting medical advice. She was actively partnering with Emma's healthcare team to optimize her daughter's treatment. Michael pulled up a folder on his computer containing Sarah's internet search history from the previous year, evidence that had been preserved through their legal discovery process. "Look at this," he said, turning the screen toward Sarah. "Do you see what you've been doing at night?" The search history was a chronological record of Sarah's nocturnal research, temporal lobe epilepsy in children, medication efficacy data, seizure management techniques, service dog training for epilepsy alert, SUDEP prevention, neuroplasticity and childhood seizures, alternative therapies for drug-resistant epilepsy. "You weren't working late at your job," Michael said quietly. "You were working late on your daughter's behalf. Every late night your ex-husband cited as evidence of neglect was actually you conducting medical research to give Emma the best possible life." Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She'd been so focused on surviving, on meeting Emma's needs, that she hadn't stopped to recognize the magnitude of what she'd been doing. The next morning, the courtroom was packed even more densely than before. Sarah recognized several pediatric neurologists in the gallery. Apparently, the case had become interesting enough to attract medical professionals. The media presence had intensified overnight. This was no longer simply a custody dispute. It was becoming a story about justice, about maternal devotion, about how the legal system had nearly failed a vulnerable child. Judge Harrison took the bench looking like a man who hadn't slept. He held multiple folders, and his expression suggested he'd spent the entire previous evening reviewing materials. His eyes were sharp, focused, and radiating controlled fury. "Before I issue my ruling," he announced, "I want to address something for the record. I have reviewed all emergency medical records, neurology documentation, medication logs, and seizure tracking materials related to Emma Mitchell's condition. I have reviewed correspondence between Ms. Mitchell and Dr. I have reviewed Ms. Mitchell's personal research notes and medical records." He adjusted his glasses and continued, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "What I have discovered is evidence of a mother engaging in behavior that would qualify as exemplary parental care under any standard. The documentation maintained by Ms. Mitchell is more thorough and detailed than what I would expect from many medical professionals. Her understanding of her daughter's condition is sophisticated and evidence-based. He turned his attention to David. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to understand something. In all of your court filings, in all of your testimony, you never once mentioned that your daughter has a serious medical condition requiring specialized care. Why is that?" David looked at Blackwood, who shook his head slightly, a gesture that suggested the attorney had no strategy left to employ. "I didn't think it mattered," David said weakly. "You didn't think it mattered," Judge Harrison repeated, his tone suggesting he found this response almost incomprehensibly naive or deliberately deceptive. "You didn't think it mattered that your daughter has a neurological condition that could potentially result in death if not properly managed. You didn't think it mattered that one parent has dedicated herself entirely to managing this condition, while the other parent refused to acknowledge its existence." The judge opened one of his folders and held up a document. "This is a medical record from Emma's seizure event at school, dated 14 months ago. It indicates that the school contacted you as an emergency contact. It indicates you arrived at the hospital. It indicates the attending physician explained to you that Emma had experienced a seizure and that she had been diagnosed with epilepsy. Is this accurate?" "Yes," David admitted. "And yet, in your custody petition, you made no mention of this. In your testimony yesterday, you made no mention of this. In fact, you actively participated in the opposing counsel's strategy of portraying Ms. Mitchell's attentiveness to Emma's medical needs as evidence of maternal neglect. This court finds that conduct troubling in the extreme." Judge Harrison's gaze swept across the courtroom. "For the record, I want to state that the video evidence presented yesterday, depicting Ms. Mitchell on a phone call during a school event, has been recontextualized by the medical records now before this court. That phone call, I have learned, was a health and safety check concerning her daughters. This court initially interpreted such behavior as evidence of maternal distraction. I now recognize it as evidence of maternal vigilance." He turned to address Michael. "Mister, I want to acknowledge that your introduction of the service animal evidence, while unconventional and technically a violation of courtroom decorum, was perhaps the most effective piece of advocacy I have witnessed in 20 years on this bench. That single gesture communicated more truth than hours of testimony could have achieved." Michael stood slightly, nodding respectfully. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "I am ordering a full investigation into the conduct of Mr. Blackwood's law firm regarding the concealment of material information. I am also recommending that the State Bar Association investigate potential ethical violations. A child's health and safety were placed at risk by the deliberate withholding of critical medical information." He turned to face David directly. "Mr. Mitchell, this court is deeply troubled by your behavior in this matter. You attempted to weaponize your daughter's medical condition against her own mother. You information that was materially relevant to custody determinations. In doing so, you placed your daughter's safety at serious risk." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Bailey's warm presence at her feet. Judge Harrison adjusted his papers and prepared to deliver his ruling. As he did, Sarah caught sight of David's face. The shock, the realization that his carefully orchestrated plan had not only failed, but had exposed him as someone willing to endanger his own child for the sake of winning a custody battle. The judge leaned forward. "I am prepared to issue my final determination in this matter, but before I do, I want Ms. Mitchell to understand something. I almost made a terrible mistake. I was prepared to recommend custody arrangements that would have removed Emma from the care of the parent most capable of protecting her. I was nearly complicit in endangering a vulnerable child. I will carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my career, as a reminder of the importance of looking beneath surface presentations to find the truth." Sarah felt Michael squeeze her hand as the moment of judgment approached, the moment that would determine her family's future. Judge Harrison's gavel hovered for a moment above the bench as he prepared to deliver the ruling that would reshape Sarah's life. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the usually chatty reporters had fallen silent, their instincts telling them that this was the moment, the crescendo that would determine the trajectory of this story. In the matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell, custody case number 2024, CV 847392, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the formal weight of judicial pronouncement. This court is rendering its decision based on the totality of evidence presented, with particular consideration to the medical documentation and evidence presented regarding the minor child's health and... He paused, removing his glasses and cleaning them deliberately, a gesture that suggested the magnitude of what he was about to say. The court finds that the respondent, Sarah Mitchell, has demonstrated exemplary parental care toward her daughter, Emma Mitchell. The court further finds that the respondent has gone above and beyond the standard requirements of parental care by acquiring specialized knowledge regarding her daughter's medical condition and implementing sophisticated management strategies designed to protect the minor's health and safety. Sarah felt Michael's hand grip hers tightly under the table. Bailey's tail began to wag softly, as though he sensed the shift in energy. The court further finds, Judge Harrison continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge, that the petitioner, David Mitchell, engaged in deliberate concealment of material information regarding the minor child's medical condition. This concealment was not accidental, not inadvertent, but appears to have been a calculated strategy to obscure information that would have significantly impacted custody determinations. In doing so, the petitioner placed his own custody interests above his daughter's health and safety. David's face had gone completely white. His attorney was frantically writing notes, but even Blackwood seemed to recognize that no clever legal maneuver would prevent what was about to happen. Therefore, Judge Harrison announced, this court awards full custody of Emma Mitchell to her mother, Sarah Mitchell. The petitioner will have supervised visitation only, limited to 8 hours per month, to be conducted in the presence of a court-appointed monitor who will ensure compliance with the minor child's medical care requirements. The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, already composing their headlines. Sarah's mother, sitting in the front row of the gallery, let out a sob of relief and joy. Several members of the public gallery applauded before the bailiff could silence them. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He raised his hand, and the courtroom quieted again, sensing that more was coming, something even more significant than the custody ruling itself. Furthermore, the judge continued, his expression hardening to something resembling stone, this court finds serious ethical violations in the conduct of counsel for the petitioner. Mr. Richard Blackwood, you deliberately presented evidence in a manner calculated to mislead this court. You discovery materials. You failed to disclose material information. You engaged in what amounts to fraud upon the court. Blackwood stood abruptly, his face flushed. Your Honor, I... Sit down, Judge Harrison commanded, his voice brooking no argument. You will not speak in my courtroom. The attorney sat, his jaw clenching with impotent rage. I am imposing sanctions against your firm in the amount of $50,000, payable to the respondent, Ms. Sarah Mitchell, the judge announced. I am also referring your conduct to the State Bar Association for investigation into potential ethical violations and possible disciplinary action up to and including disbarment. A murmur rippled through the gallery. This was extraordinary. Disbarment recommendations were rare, reserved for the most egregious violations of professional ethics. Judge Harrison turned his attention to David. Mr. Mitchell, you will be ordered to undergo a parenting education course specifically focused on children with medical conditions. You will be required to attend appointments with doctor to gain a thorough understanding of your daughter's condition and the proper management protocols. You will pay all costs associated with Emma's medical care, including her service animals' training and maintenance. He paused, and his expression suggested he had saved the most significant announcement for last. Additionally, this court is recommending to the district attorney's office that an investigation be opened into whether your conduct constitutes criminal endangerment of a minor. A child with a serious medical condition was placed at risk by the deliberate concealment of information necessary for her safe care and custody determination. The courtroom absolutely exploded. Reporters were shouting questions. Photographers' cameras flashed incessantly. David looked like he might actually lose consciousness, his face turning from white to a sickly shade of gray. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. "I'm not finished," he said coldly. "This court is also issuing a modification to standard custody arrangements. Ms. Mitchell will be granted decision-making authority over all matters related to Emma's medical care, education, and the petitioner will have no authority to make decisions regarding Emma's treatment, her medications, her school placement, or any matter related to her health. Any attempt to interfere with or override these decisions will result in further sanctions and potential contempt charges." He looked directly at Sarah, and his expression softened slightly from its judicial severity to something more human. "Ms. Mitchell, this court acknowledges that you have been treated unjustly by these proceedings. You came before this court in good faith, seeking to protect your daughters. Instead, you were subjected to a campaign of character assassination based on carefully manipulated evidence. I want to publicly state that this court erred in its initial assessment of your fitness as a parent, and I take full responsibility for nearly making a catastrophic mistake." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face uncontrollably now. Bailey pressed against her leg, his warmth grounding her as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. "However," Judge Harrison continued, "your actions in this courtroom yesterday, your gesture toward your daughter's service animal, demonstrated a form of maternal advocacy that transcended courtroom protocol and reached directly to the heart of truth. Sometimes," he said, looking directly at the gallery full of reporters and legal observers, "the law's procedures can obscure justice. Sometimes, a mother's knowledge of her child proves more powerful than 100 depositions." He addressed the courtroom as a whole. "I'm also issuing a directive that will be circulated to all judges in this district. In any custody case where a minor child has a documented medical condition, comprehensive medical records and documentation of that condition must be presented during initial discovery. Failure to disclose such information will result in automatic case continuance pending investigation into potential concealment. This court will not allow another child's safety to be compromised by deliberate omission of critical information." Judge Harrison gathered his papers and looked at Sarah one final time. "Ms. Mitchell, you have demonstrated the qualities that make an excellent parent: devotion, vigilance, medical knowledge, and above all, an unwavering commitment to your daughter's safety, and this court finds you fit, capable, and worthy of full custody of your daughter. Emma is fortunate to have you as her mother." With that, he stood and exited the bench, his robe swirling behind him. The courtroom descended into absolute pandemonium. Members of the public gallery stood and applauded openly. Michael embraced Sarah while she wept, tears of relief, vindication, and overwhelming emotion. Her mother pushed through the crowd, wrapping both Sarah and Bailey in an embrace, her own tears of joy freely flowing. Across the courtroom, David sat motionless, looking like a man whose entire world had collapsed around him. Blackwood was already conferring with other attorneys, presumably discussing strategies to fight the ethical charges and sanctions. But Sarah barely noticed. She was focused entirely on the magnitude of what had just happened. She had won, not just the custody case, but something far more important: complete vindication. The judge had publicly acknowledged that she had been treated unjustly. The legal system had recognized her extraordinary devotion to her daughter, and most critically, Emma was safe, secure, and protected under her mother's full care. As the bailiff began clearing the courtroom and reporters rushed toward her with microphones and cameras, Michael placed a protective hand on Sarah's back and guided her toward the exit. Bailey walked beside them, calm and regal, the dog who had changed everything with a single gesture. "You did it," Michael whispered. "Against all odds, you won." Sarah looked down at Bailey, at the vest identifying him as a service animal, at the dog who had known exactly when to move, exactly how to communicate truth that words could never articulate. "We did it," she corrected him. "All of us." 6 months had passed since Judge Harrison's ruling reverberated through the courtroom and into the broader legal landscape. Sarah stood in the sunlit kitchen of her newly renovated home, watching Emma through the window as she played in the backyard with Bailey. The golden retriever lay beside Emma's wheelchair-accessible therapy swing, alert and present as always, monitoring her young charge with the dedication that had become legendary in medical and legal circles. Emma had blossomed in ways that Sarah barely dared to hope for during those dark days of the custody battle. The consistent, loving care, combined with Bailey's alerting abilities and doctor-optimized medication regimen, had reduced her seizure frequency dramatically. She was now experiencing seizures only once every 2 to 3 weeks, a remarkable improvement from the multiple episodes per week she'd endured before Bailey's arrival. More importantly, Emma's confidence had transformed. No longer living in fear of the next seizure, she was thriving academically, socially, and emotionally. Her school had implemented Bailey's presence into Emma's official educational plan, and the service dog was now recognized as essential to her academic success. Teachers reported that Emma participated more actively in class discussions, showed improved focus, and had developed genuine friendships with classmates who initially saw Bailey as a fascinating addition to their learning environment. Sarah's mother entered the kitchen, carrying a stack of mail. "There's another one," she said, holding up an envelope bearing official letterhead. "Another university program requesting your participation in their panel discussion on pediatric epilepsy and family law." Sarah smiled, accepting the envelope. In the months since the trial, she had become something of an unexpected expert witness and advocate. She'd been invited to speak at medical conferences, legal seminars, and patient advocacy organizations. Her unique perspective, combining maternal experience with legal precedent, had resonated deeply with audiences who recognized the profound intersection of medicine, law, and human dignity. But the most significant development had been legislative. 3 states had already passed what was being informally called Mitchell's Law legislation, requiring mandatory disclosure of children's medical conditions in all custody proceedings. 2 additional states had proposed similar measures. Judge Harrison's recommendation, combined with the media attention surrounding the case, had created a groundswell of support for legal reforms designed to prevent future cases where a child's medical needs could be weaponized in custody disputes. The State Bar Association's investigation into Richard Blackwood had concluded 3 months ago. He had been disbarred, his license permanently revoked. David's law practice had dissolved, with his remaining clients fleeing to other attorneys. He'd attempted to appeal Judge Harrison's ruling, but appellate courts had upheld every aspect of the decision, citing the thorough documentation of Emma's medical condition and Sarah's exemplary care. As for David himself, his path had taken an unexpected turn. After initial resistance and denial, he had enrolled in the court-ordered parenting course. More significantly, he had begun attending sessions with Dr., slowly learning about Emma's condition and the complexity of her medical management. His supervised visitations with Emma, monitored by court-appointed observers, had gradually shifted from awkward and tense to something resembling genuine connection. He was learning to see Emma's epilepsy not as something to deny or downplay, but as a reality that required understanding and compassion. Sarah had harbored considerable skepticism about David's transformation, but Michael had advised her to remain cautiously open. People sometimes need to hit bottom before they can change, he'd said. Your ex-husband is hitting bottom. What he does with that moment is his choice. 6 months into supervised visitation, David had surprised everyone by asking to undertake additional training in epilepsy management. He'd expressed interest in understanding Bailey's alert mechanisms. He'd begun accompanying Emma to doctor's appointments, taking detailed notes. It wasn't redemption. Sarah wasn't naive enough to believe that, but it was something. It was a man acknowledging his mistakes and attempting, however imperfectly, to become a better parent to his daughter. The criminal endangerment investigation had been closed without charges being filed, though the district attorney had issued a strongly worded statement about the seriousness of concealing medical information in custody cases. Judge Harrison's recommendation had achieved its purpose. It had created a legal precedent and a public understanding that such concealment would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, Sarah's professional life had evolved in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd been offered a promotion at her marketing firm, one that came with genuine flexibility to accommodate Emma's needs. Her supervisor, impressed by her demonstrated ability to manage complex situations with creativity and determination, had essentially created a position that allowed Sarah to maintain her career while prioritizing her daughters. Other employees with children facing medical challenges had begun approaching Sarah for advice on how to advocate for similar arrangements. More significantly, Sarah had been approached by the Epilepsy Foundation about serving on their board of directors. She'd accepted, bringing her unique perspective of both patient advocacy and legal reform to their strategic discussions. Several of her ideas for improving support systems for families managing childhood epilepsy had already been implemented or were in pilot phases. Bailey, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity in his own right. A veterinary school had requested permission to use video footage of his alert behaviors for educational purposes. A documentary filmmaker had approached Sarah about creating a short film about the case and its legal ramifications. Bailey's trainers, who'd invested thousands of hours in his development, had received multiple inquiries from other families seeking similar dogs and had established a waiting list extending 2 years into the future. On a quiet evening in late spring, Sarah sat with Emma in the backyard. The child nestled against her mother's side, Bailey's head resting across both their laps. Emma was drawing with colored pencils, creating what appeared to be a picture of their family, herself, Sarah, Bailey, and even a small figure she identified as Grandma. "Mommy," Emma said, looking up from her drawing, "do you remember when Daddy didn't believe about my seizures?" Sarah's heart caught slightly at the question. Emma had a remarkable memory, especially about emotionally significant events. At 7 years old, she was already developing an understanding of her own history and the events that had shaped her life. "I do remember," Sarah said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because Daddy said sorry yesterday, during our visit. He said he didn't understand before, but now he does. He said he was wrong." Emma paused, considering this revelation with the seriousness of a child who took her words very carefully. "I think he really means it now." Sarah pulled her daughter closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and childhood. "People sometimes take a long time to understand things," she said gently. "Your daddy loves you very much. He's working hard now to understand your epilepsy and how to take care of you better." Emma returned to her drawing, satisfied with this explanation. Bailey adjusted his position, his ears perking up momentarily before relaxing again, a behavior that suggested he was monitoring for any changes in Emma's neurological state, ever vigilant even during moments of peace and connection. That night, after Emma was asleep and Bailey was resting peacefully at the foot of her bed, Sarah received a text message from Michael. It was a link to a legal journal article, Mitchell v. Mitchell, How One Case Changed Family Law and Medical Disclosure Requirements. The article analyzed the ruling's legal significance and its impact on custody law across multiple jurisdictions. Sarah read through it, noting how her case was now being cited as precedent in other disputes involving children with medical conditions. She thought about Judge Harrison's admission that he'd almost made a catastrophic mistake. She thought about how close she'd come to losing Emma, not through death or illness, but through a system designed to protect children that had nearly failed to do exactly that. But she'd prevailed, not through clever legal arguments alone, but through truth, through a mother's unwavering commitment to her child's, and through the remarkable bond between a girl and the dog who had quite literally changed the trajectory of her life. Looking back on the ordeal that had consumed the past year, Sarah recognized that she'd emerged transformed. She was no longer simply a mother fighting to keep her daughter. She was an advocate, a voice for children whose medical needs might otherwise be overlooked in custody disputes. She was a living testament to the power of maternal devotion, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful truth can be communicated without words. Just a gesture, a dog's movement across a courtroom, and a mother's love that refused to be silenced. Emma slept peacefully in her room, her seizure frequency continuing to decline, her future brightening with each passing month. Bailey rested nearby, ever watchful, ever present, and Sarah sat in the quiet of the evening, at peace with what she had fought for and won, not just custody but justice, validation, and the security of knowing that her daughter was safe, loved, and protected. The case had become something larger than itself, a catalyst for legal reform, a testimony to the importance of disclosure and transparency, and ultimately, a story about a mother and daughter whose bond proved stronger than any opposing counsel, any manipulated evidence, or any attempt to diminish the power of maternal love. In the end, it was Bailey who had reminded the world of what truly mattered, the safety and of a child, and the extraordinary lengths a devoted mother would go to protect her. Retry can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.